Okay, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, the collection of money for the poor Jewish Christians in Judea. And even though these chapters kind of form a transitional section between Paul's defense of his ministry in chapters 2 and 7 and his defense of his ministry in 10 to 13, they are very important chapters to Paul. I mean, the collection is referenced in 1 Corinthians. Of course, here in 2 Corinthians, it comes up in Paul's letter to Romans and Galatians. Luke references it in the book of Acts. I mean, it's a very important moment. And the historical background for this collection was that there was a famine in the land in those days. And I guess Judea was hit particularly hard by this famine. And the Jewish Christians in particular were very poor and they're finding it hard to support themselves. And they were certainly more poor than the Gentile Christians. So Paul went around to the churches that he planted in Galatia and Macedonia and Achaia, and he said, why don't you collect some money so you can send it to the poor Christians in Judea? And not only is that just the Christian thing to do, a good positive demonstration of love, but also Paul sees it as a profound act and gesture of unity between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. So that it is an important moment for that as well. And let's discuss this collection in 2 Corinthians in two sections. The situation behind Corinth's participation in the collection, and then arguments why the Corinthians should participate in this collection. So, you remember the book of 1 Corinthians, right? And in 1 Corinthians, the first half, Paul's responding to a report from Chloe. And the second half, he's responding to questions from those in Corinth. And each of those questions starts with, now concerning this, now concerning that, now concerning this other thing. And one of the final now concernings is the collection. This is in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians. Let's see that. Here we are. Now concerning the collection for the saints, Paul says, just as I directed the churches in Galatia, so you are to do the same thing. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put something aside, store it up, so that when I come to collect the money, I won't have to be collecting it all from you at that moment, but you will have set it aside progressively. So that was a year ago. A year ago, Paul sent this letter to Corinth and gave them those instructions, and things were going great initially. Initially, they had followed Paul's instructions, and they were setting things aside for the poor Christians in Judea. Look at this. Now we're in 2 Corinthians 8. Let's jump over there. 2 Corinthians 8. Look at verse 10. You a year ago started not only to do this work, but to desire to do it. You were earnest in your setting aside of funds for these poor, suffering Christians. But since that time, you kind of stalled out a little bit. You've lost your zeal. And Paul says, you know what? Time is running out. I'm going to bring this gift to the Judeans in just a few months. Therefore, I'm going to send Titus and I'm going to send more brothers with him to collect these funds from you. And man, be ready when they get there. Paul's going to say, in that's the situation here in 2 Corinthians. Now we're going to get a series of arguments. Paul is trying to persuade them to joyfully participate in this act of love. And as I read these chapters closely, it seems to me that there are probably maybe even 9 different arguments that Paul utilizes why they should participate, but I'm going to give you the top 3. Really, what I think are the most important reasons Paul is rhetorically using. The first one is that this gift is a proof of the Corinthians' love. Paul calls on them to prove your love, and he's going to start by and this is so unique. He's going to use a little bit of sanctified peer pressure. Look at this. By comparing the generosity of the Macedonians. Now, he says here in 8:1, I want you to know, brothers, about this grace of God among the churches in Macedonia. And this word grace, very important in this section. I want you to know about the grace given to the churches in Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means. Sure, I can testify to that. But beyond that, they gave beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this little moment is kind of a it encapsulates another primary theme of the book of Second Corinthians. This idea of the paradox of Christian living. Paul's going to say in chapter 6 that he's sorrowful, yet he's always rejoicing. He has this great treasure, but it's a treasure that's in jars of clay. And so here with the Macedonians, they were afflicted and yet joyful. They were extremely poor and yet generous. How was that possible except through the work of the Spirit? You see, in this age, we're talking now about this idea of the paradox of Christian living. You see, in this age, it is a cross-carrying age. And one day we're going to exchange that cross for a crown, but right now we carry our cross as Christ did. And yet, even though we carry our cross, we are still called more than conquerors. Our outer self is wasting away, but our inner self is being renewed. And the inner self of the Macedonians was certainly renewed, and that enabled them to give so generously to the suffering saints in Judea. So Paul's going to put on that sanctified peer pressure, and he's saying, be like the Macedonians. Look at this. He says, so give proof before the churches in Macedonia, of your love. Prove your love and our boasting. And then it's going to get a little bit awkward. Look at this. For Paul says, man, I know your readiness. I know your readiness, of which I boasted about you to the people of Macedonia. Remember, Paul is in Macedonia as he's writing the letter of 2 Corinthians. He's like, man, I've told them that you've been ready since last year. Now, how awkward would it be if some of these Macedonians were to come with me to Corinth and find that you are not ready? Oh my gosh, that would be so humiliating. So see how he's using this peer pressure? It's a unique application of the honor-shame culture here. But Paul is saying, man, prove your love and your readiness. Second argument that we're going to discuss, it's another really interesting one. So you remember that those in Corinth are fixated with spiritual gifts, right? It says in 1 Corinthians 14:12 that they are eager for manifestations of the Spirit. And Paul is going to return to that subject here in 2 Corinthians, and he's going to say, hey, you know what? Generosity and giving, that is a spiritual gift too. And I want you to excel in that spiritual gift, excel in this grace also. Let's look at that verse. It really speaks to kind of their background, especially in 1 Corinthians. So this is verse 7. Just as you excel in everything. I mean, you excel in faith, in speech. Remember how big of a deal that was in 1 Corinthians? Some follow Paul, some follow Apollos, some follow Cephas. Just as you excel in speech and in knowledge and in earnestness, see that you excel in this act of grace also. And then I want to look at one final argument why the Corinthians should participate in this collection, and it's really Paul's strongest argument. He saves the best for last here. He's going to reference again the great exchange. You remember that from chapter 5, verse 21, that he made him who knew no sin to be sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. So Jesus, though he was rich, he became poor in order that we, in our poverty, might become rich. This is in verse 9 of chapter 8. You know the grace. Remember, this word is coming back again. You know the grace of our Lord Jesus. Though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And even in this instance of poverty and riches, the paradox of Christian living, this kind of central core theme in 2 Corinthians is going to return. And you remember back in chapter 6, we only read part of this verse when we discussed it earlier. Paul is sorrowful, yet he's always rejoicing. He's poor outwardly, yet he's making many people rich inwardly. He has nothing, yet he possesses everything. You see, even with this, in this area of money and finances, things are not as they seem, Paul is arguing. As those new covenant believers, we walk by faith and not by sight, by outward, visible prosperity. We look to the things that are seen. We look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen, the spiritual riches and our eternal reward. And Paul's going to apply this argument in our next and our final section of 2 Corinthians, in which Paul addresses some of his opponents, which would discredit him because of his outward poverty. We'll see that next.